We've got a screening of a documentary about Drury Brown, who was one of the great civil rights leaders of Virginia and was from right here in Charlottesville. We'll have a number of the living bridge builders who've been recognized by the city as the bridge builders in the community, and they will be there to talk about their work that they've done. All the events we do are entirely free. They're open to everyone. No tickets or reservations are required, and I'd be happy to put you on our email list to let you know all about them. Tonight, Jeffrey Hantman is going to talk about his new book, The Monacan Millennium, and I want every single one of you to go out this beautiful Memorial Day weekend and buy this book and read it, because you are going to get so much from the book, and tonight is just a little bit of taste of the work that this incredible scholar has been doing for decades. He has devoted his entire career to the Monacan story, and this is a real collaboration. I mean, the work that Jeff has done. I met Jeff 30 years ago, sitting in his office as a young, complete. I got a degree from William & Mary, no clue what I want to do with my life, but I think I want to go to grad school and study anthropology. And I was sitting in his office, and he said, "The thing you have to know about this department," and this is Jeff talking to me in 1989, and he said, "It changed the whole way I think about the work I do and the archaeology that I do. It made me truly, this department and being around these people truly made me an anthropologist who just happens to do archaeology, not just an archaeologist." And that awareness that this is really about people and creating meaning and identity and relationships. It's not just about potsherds and stained earth. That really impacted and led us to this book. And this is a beautiful, important, timely work of anthropology by an archaeologist and an anthropologist. And I don't want to waste any more of his time. Please know this is an incredibly unique and rare opportunity to hear from one of my all-time favorite teachers and scholars. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeffrey Hantman.
Thank you. Thanks, Arlene. Thank you, Coy. Thank all of you. This is a holiday weekend. What are you doing here? I'm honored, and I appreciate your coming out tonight. And I hope I can answer some questions and tell a narrative, the story of the Monacan Indian people who, for thousands of years, lived in the Charlottesville area, and today can be found as the largest tribe in the state. About 2,100 people living in Amherst County. And have the story I want to tell comes in three parts. One, who were the Monacan? Where did they live? Second, I want to attack, if you will, the word disappear. Because there's many a museum, I don't want to name names, some of them associated with famous presidents, who begin their presentations by saying, by the time early president arrived, or early president's father arrived, the Monacan people had disappeared. They don't speak like that, but I just kept hearing this word over and over again. They had disappeared, and I thought, that's a mystical act. How does that happen? How do people disappear? And okay, they may have moved on, but nobody was saying that. Disappear just excuses the displacement by colonial settlers of indigenous people. And that's a big part of our story in Charlotte, in Albemarle, Charlottesville, Nelson County, and throughout the Piedmont and beyond. So that's the second part. The third part is to talk about the community today, the federally recognized Monacan Indian people of Amherst County, and how we might think about these people whose ancestry is here, whose ancestors are buried prominently in earthen mounds 2 miles from where we now sit. How we might think about them in terms of Unity Day and the city of Charlottesville, and simply recognizing their past, very important past, and their current status. I was going to end on this note, but I'll just drop it here. There's nothing in the city that acknowledges this was a Monacan place once. And we were pretty good at, or we're getting better at, having a series of inclusive historic signs and signage and looking at others that aren't. Well, I won't go into all of that, but maybe to think about how we might think about Monacan history in this area as part of the diverse history of this place. And nobody disappeared, and the descendants are still here. So I'll try to do that in 30 minutes or so. That usually translates to 45 minutes. I'll try to be fast, because your questions inevitably will be the most interesting. I do want to begin. I work very closely with the Monacan Indian people, collaborate, and I feel like whenever I'm speaking at an event like this, I'm speaking on behalf of the tribe. The book that Coy so kindly mentioned was read in draft by the tribal council and many members of the tribe, and a large part of the book is what I learned from the Monacan people, as opposed to what I was trying to teach them. And so it's a back and forth. In that book, back and forth, I just want to echo what we say at the University of Virginia events, and what the Monacan people ask us to note is that, and I'm reading their text, we acknowledge that the Monacan people are the traditional custodians of the land in and around Charlottesville and Albemarle. And just to note that, where we sit right now was Monacan land. If we leave that in past tense, we're not acknowledging the fact that the ancestors are among us. And that's a very real feeling. If you think about cemeteries, there are prominent Native American cemeteries in this region. So no one in the Monacan community considers this a lost place with no connection. They think of it as part of their ancestral territory. And they care very much. And there have been ceremonies in the past where that's been acknowledged. And I just want to say that at the outset, to acknowledge the Monacan people as the traditional custodians of this land. So, part one, who were the Monacans? And to go into that past tense, I'm not going to go 10,000 years back. I'm going to just go back approximately 1,000 years, because that's when the Indian people have always lived in central Virginia. Indian people have lived in Virginia further than you could go back, minimally 12,000 years, but probably more. But it's at about 1000 AD, which is about 1,000 years ago, and that's why the title of the book is Monacan Millennium, what happened over the last 1,000 years. And the Monacans play quite a prominent role for 700 of those, well actually 800 of those years. But I want to talk about what was happening between 1000 AD and about 1700, okay? Who were the Monacans in those years? And some of these images will be familiar places to you because they're right out the door. Not at the Friday celebration, but just to our local rivers, which is what drew the Monacan people as far as building towns, villages, hamlets, agricultural fields, burial mounds, etc. So just a few, I don't have many slides, but this is what's known as Point of Forks. This is the Rivanna meeting the James near the historic town of Columbia in Fluvanna County. And I just show that image. I love this particular place, but it was the home of the Monacan town called Rassawick, which one Monacan man taken captive by the noted colonist Captain John Smith. Smith took a man captive at the fall line near modern-day Fredericksburg, and said, tell me about the towns on the James, tell me about the towns on the Rappahannock. And he talked about this place. The Indian man from the Piedmont said, there is a town called Rassawick, and it is the chiefest place. It's located here. that's a pipeline is going through there, so there's a hell of a fight going on. Excuse me. There's a heck of a fight going on because this place should be protected. It is a sacred place. Monacan people know of it. It's also central to the Monacan territory. And then this is close to home. This is the Rivanna in Charlottesville. On the South Fork of the Rivanna, a couple of miles from here, was another one of the chiefest towns of the Monacans. It's known as Montesupanaw. If you're around Charlottesville for enough time, you might hear that term. It's not easy to say or spell, but we get the pronunciation and the spelling from this Piedmont Indian named, his name was Amarolek, and he told John Smith, when you make your map, have this river go up, extend from the James, and there's a big town right here, and it's called Montesupanaw. So from the sizable but smaller streams, like the Rivanna, to the James, from Richmond to the Blue Ridge, that's Monacan territory. From the Rappahannock River to the James, and a little bit south of the James. This is modernized, my attempt to make accessible. I'm not sure I succeeded in that. This map is not in the book. We have clearer maps in the book. But this is a map of the known named Monacan towns. Can you hear? You can hear me when I step away from this? Okay. So here's modern-day Richmond. Here's modern-day Fredericksburg and modern-day Charlottesville. And here's the James and the Rivanna. And these houses, this is the actual icon that Captain John Smith used on his map of Virginia that he drew in 1608, published in 1612. And we see, here's this town of Rassawick. Here's Charlottesville in 1608, 1612. Montesupanaw. Out a little further west, beyond Scottsville, is Montahasinaw. I've dug there with some of my students. And then closer to Richmond are two towns, Mohemcho and Messinicac. So on the James and Rivanna, those are the 5 towns that are named. And you may have seen the John Smith map. I'll show you the original, not the original, that's the museum, but a copy of the John Smith map. And you see these 5 towns. Up on the Rappahannock River, there's 7 towns. And I won't go through all of them, but it's Orange County, Greene County line, over to Fredericksburg. It's all Monacan territory. And how do I know it's all Monacan territory? Because we find the remnants of these villages. Now, to show you the remnants, what did Coy say? It's not all broken pottery and stains in the ground. I could show you those, but instead I'm showing you these reconstructions of what the towns might have looked like. They're not cities, but there are these there's a Monacan house that's been reconstructed, a kind of Ramada work area. This is actually a Powhatan village, but the villages were very much the same. That one is where Wacomico, where Chief Powhatan lived with his daughter Pocahontas. That's a National Geographic reconstruction that I've borrowed just for this slide talk. So they're not huge cities, but let me add the key concept. We look at the map and we see 5 towns on the James. We see 7 towns on the Rappahannock, and 400 years after the English first settled here, after John Smith published his map in England, had tremendous influence, we say, oh, there were 12 Monacan towns. Wrong. There were 12 towns that Amarolek chose to tell the man who captured him, John Smith. There were 12 towns that Amarolek chose to talk about. These were the chiefest towns. They're often associated with large burial mounds. Not always, but sometimes. What John Smith wrote in his text accompanying the map is that there are these towns and diverse more. Well, diversity has a particular meaning in 2019 that we care a lot about. But in 1608, 1612, diverse others, diverse meant so many I can't count them. There are diverse others. So when we look back at this map, which is framed on many walls and offices across Virginia, governors, state representatives, teachers, this map is reproduced, and there's 5 towns. But in fact, and I know from archaeological survey, of the broken pottery and the soil stains, the Monacans spread out across the Jamestown or Amana. And we're here in great numbers. How many? Probably 14 to 15,000 in the 2 river drainages. And that would make them about the same population size as what's known as the Powhatan chiefdom. So this is the John Smith map of Virginia. Has everybody seen this? Ad nauseum? Okay, I won't dwell on it. For some reason that I've never gotten sorted out, north is this way. This is the Chesapeake Bay, and west is that way. So this is Jamestown right here, and you go west, and you see the word, and I've got that blown up, you see the word Monacan up on the western part of the map. So this tribe, this culture, these people were here, and Smith documented it. But all of these red crosses, which appear as iron crosses on Smith's map, I've enhanced them so you can see them. What John, for all the lies and stories and fantasies John Smith had, he was very honest about this map. And on this map he indicated the territory that he had gone and seen with his own eyes. And beyond a certain point was by relation only. That's his phrase. By relation only, which means Amaroa told me a few things. I was too scared to go into the Piedmont because I knew the Monacan were powerful people, and nobody from the Powhatan world was willing to take me there. So what I know about the Charlottesville, Albemarle, Nelson, etc., Savannah, is what I hear from my Piedmont captive. And if you follow this line, this semicircle, that's all the territory that Smith saw with his own eyes, was in those villages, was talking to people. That's why we have so much about the Algonquian or the Powhatan people. But above the line, he never went. He never went. And that means everything we know about the Monacans, and I include the Manahoics as a cousin or part of the Monacan world, everything we know about them is secondhand and possibly invented, right? Because Smith left to his brothers, he made up some good stories, as he did about Pocahontas. This is an enhanced version of Smith's map. This is what the crosses, that's his mark, that's as far as he went. Cross here, cross there. And beyond that, these Monacan towns, you can see in Smith's own hand, he learns about by relation only, which isn't a lot of detail. One is the chiefest town, another is a large town. That's why the archaeology and the oral history from the Monacan people plays a big role in answering the question of who they were. There's many things we could talk about that distinguish Monacan culture, but the one that I think resonates with the theme of this speaker series, Unity Days, it resonates with projects that have been done in Charlottesville, is the presence of burial mounds. Now, none of them, there were 13 prominent burial mounds in the Charlottesville, Albemarle, Stanton area, and they marked Monacan territory. Now, you might be saying, I'm crazy because this one is in Arkansas. I can't show you one from Charlottesville because there are none standing above ground. And that's a long story about how the past is wiped out by farmers. The first farmers, Peter Jefferson, Ambrose Madison, they came in, they said we need flat land to plant, and the mounds were pushed down. The Boy Scouts, God bless them, would get points in the early 20th century by digging into mounds. And so they were flattened. I show you this one because it's about the same size as, and the same appearance of the mounds that the Monacans left behind. Does that make sense? And there are trees growing. Thomas Jefferson described one on the, what we call the Carsbrook floodplain, low ground, what we call the Carsbrook low ground. I'm the only one who says floodplain. He says that he describes the trees growing on top of the mound since it had ceased to be used every day. And so that's why I chose this particular mound from Arkansas, the Parkin Mound. It's a good model of what would have been around. They were, in TJ's own words, because he wrote about them in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, they were monuments on the landscape. His French correspondents asked him, are there any monuments in Virginia? And Jefferson said, if by that you mean like Pompeii or Stonehenge, no, not exactly. But if by labor and size and impact on the landscape, you should look at these earthen mounds. Big point about them. The mound that was about the same size as this, and looked like that until at least 1730, by my estimation, here in Charlottesville, and another one in Orange County that, for various reasons, working with the tribe, we excavated, returned the human remains to the people who they're reburied. Here's the key point. Indian people are often thought of as mobile. They're always on some warrior path or trading path, or going from their hunters and gatherers, foraging, looking for the big hunt. Maybe so, maybe in some years. But they lived in these villages, and the villages were associated with the mounds. And to make the point, in the mound in Charlottesville, there were 1,000 people interred in that mound. That's a lot of time that people were in one place, burying the dead. And they're buried in features of about 30 individuals each. So how many burial events does it take? I mean, divide 1,000 by 30. How many events does it take to build up a mound? The mound in Orange County has 2,000, this one we know with great detail, 2,160 people were buried there. So that's a mark of permanence, and it's a cemetery, and we respect cemeteries. And in Charlottesville, we've worked very hard to preserve cemeteries that had been ignored and had been wiped out. And so while it may be a leap, when you think about Daughters of Zion, a wonderful project, this cemetery, the ones that's in Charlottesville, is not asking to be restored. It's a different culture, it's a different kind of site. But it is a sacred place where the ancestors live today. They're buried there. And so I ask you to think about that in terms of modern day connections. The Monacan people may live principally in Amherst County, but their ancestors, as recently as 1730, as recently as 1754 to be specific, are buried here. And still, they remain. Wow. Let's forget about that. That didn't translate to in being enlarged, and that's okay. That map, you can just recognize the colors. These purple dots are all the mounds, earthen mounds, 13 of them. It's interesting, there are 12 up here, and then one here, which is very close to where the Monacan people live today. And it doesn't have that many people in it. So this mound had 2,100 people, this had 1,000. And we know that Monacan people dispersed after Peter Jefferson and the Carr family, and when people first came into Charlottesville, they dispersed. And one of the places they went to is about here. So it's interesting that where the mounds are all clustered, there's one that's just getting off the main road being the James and the Rivanna. This is Jefferson's book, Notes on the State of Virginia. I think I've said as much as I want to say about that. He, although it's always conflicted with Jefferson, isn't it? Had he not dug into an earthen burial mound, and he returned the bones to the ground, he didn't collect them. Great, this man who collected so many things, he didn't collect human remains. He returned them to the earth, reburied them, having disturbed them, and he wrote about it. And without that written section of his book, we wouldn't know as much as we know. On the other hand, he knew it was a burial mound, and he shouldn't have disturbed it. So it's a mixed, as so often happens, it's mixed. How am I doing? I cannot see that clock.
You're doing great, don't worry about it.
Doing okay. So, a few years ago, the soccer organization of Charlottesville planned their South Fork soccer fields. And the county, board of supervisors, everybody was great, frankly, and the organization, soccer organization itself was great. They were planning to build fields. The land had been donated to them. It's on the low grounds. It's on the floodplain, so it's flat. And it may flood every once in a while, but if you want soccer fields, you want flat. But those fields also had the remnants of Montezuma in them. And the county and SACA and the Monacan people and the University of Virginia and my department, we all worked collaboratively. It was quite remarkable. And figured out a way, we did this archaeological testing. You can see areas where the soil is turned dark from fires that had burned back in the 1600s and 1700s. There are a lot of artifacts that came out of there. We just did enough testing to be able to say to the county and to SACA, gee, if you could just turn your soccer fields from east-west to north-south, you wouldn't disturb this area. And they said, okay. That wasn't easy. So it was a great example of archaeology not, quote-unquote, getting in the way, but collaboration. The Monacan people came up and kept track of the excavation. There was a blessing ceremony before the sacred site was disturbed by the archaeologists, me. And we learned a lot. Just very quickly, without showing you too many archaeological objects. These are two pieces of pottery that came out of that dig. And I ask you to just note these little punctation marks. And if you can, over here, if you can see them, on like a 45-degree angle, there are also punctated designs. So what, you might say? Well, we didn't know exactly how old this village was. So there are these two pieces of pottery, and I went over to Jamestown, which we know was lived in before 1607 by the Paspahegh people, and then at around 1607 and beyond, and we compared notes. Now their pots are a lot bigger. They haven't been hit by the same level of flooding, but the decoration that you see here is the same as what we found at Montezuma, which began to tell me that Montezuma was not only does it show up on the Smith map, but it's probably lived in throughout the 17th century, just as these artifacts were found in datable 17th century contexts in Jamestown. In the same way, these are what most people call arrowheads, and that's not a bad name in this case because they were arrowheads. They were the points on arrows that were shot at the James Fort, at John Smith, at anyone who interfered. So they're small, triangular, made of Piedmont quartz that you might all know, but really clear quartz, crystal quartz, beautiful, and one piece of chert, which would have come from the Blue Ridge. Again, I went over and looked at the Jamestown collections with Bill Kelso, and you see that the same arrows that were being shot at the colonists, 1607, 1609, 1612, 1622, on into the 17th century, we see the same style. That doesn't happen by coincidence. That dates Montezuma to the 17th century, or makes a good case for that. What have we done to note that? There's a highway sign. I love highway signs. This highway sign sits now, used to be on Route 29. If you stopped to read it, you took your life in your own hands. I'm sure most of you did because you're interested. But it's now in a much safer spot on Rio Mills Road. There are two signs, one for the mill and the Monacan Indian Village. And I'm very, I wrote that with Karen Wood, a member of the Monacan Indian tribe. And I tell this to everybody, if you want a challenge, try and write the history of the people who lived in a region for 1,000 years in 100 words. Because you only get 100 words on a highway sign. So you can tell me how we did. To resist the story of disappearance, and then I'll get very close to stopping, just a couple of images. Number one is this is known as the Bland map. It was drafted in 1650. And I put that red circle there, and that word is Monacans. So did they disappear? No. They moved a little further west. You can see they're more in the mountains, not directly on the James or the Roy Mountain. Did they disappear? No. But they moved here and they moved there. Some Monacan ancestors joined with the Tuscarora and moved to Pennsylvania and then on to Ontario. The last speaker of the native Monacan language was found in Ontario, and he was interviewed. And that's the most we know about the Tutelo language that they spoke. Some joined with other native speakers of similar cousin languages in South Carolina, like the Catawba people. And some stayed in town, but in places where they couldn't be seen by the colonial government. And this isn't a good topographic map, but I want to bring to your attention, this is us. Southwest Mountains. This is historic sites noted from a map drawn between 1727 and 1730 by, that's the Nicholas Merriweather land grants. And I point you to this spot, a place called Indian Fields. In 1730, there's a place called Indian Fields. Now, you drive around subdivisions today, and you'll see a lot of reference to Monacan, Powhatan, Indian, Cherokee. Every possible allusion to Indians is celebrated in a modern-day subdivision. You know what? In 1730, nobody was celebrating the Indian presence. When you see the name Indian Fields, that means the Nicholas Merriweather land grant included property on which Indians who had been planting had been displaced. And the name given to the place is Indian Fields. Morven, Steve, Indian Camp. Was that like to raise real estate values? Let's call this place Indian Camp. No, it's because there were Indians living there. And when they were displaced by the first settlers, that's the name that went on the map. Our place names, our maps of Central Virginia are a real record of Indian Camp, Indian fields, Indian gardens. Jefferson's quarter called Tufton was Indian gardens. They're everywhere. And again, I stress, what you see here is where people were living as late as the 1700s. Because if that was a field that had been planted in 1400, there'd be no evidence of it. But when they named the place Indian Field or Indian Camp or Indian Garden, even Jefferson says that the mound he studied was across the Rivanna from the remains of an Indian village. That's because he was looking at the remains of an Indian village that the Carr family, I don't know who, but the Carrs lived there and Peter Jefferson wasn't far away. They displaced those people. And Jefferson could still see the remnants of where they lived. So that's 1730. This is 1754. I won't go into detail. This is Thomas Jefferson's description of witnessing a visit to the burial mound on the Rivanna in 1754. And he describes it in great detail. People came through the woods knowing exactly where they were going, carried out some mournful tasks, he says. And this took place in 1754, and he reports that. It's forever, included in his book. So nobody disappeared. And even those who moved, say, south to the southern parts of Nelson and Amherst County, came back to the burial ground because that's where their ancestors were. I'm very moved by that. I want to leave time for your questions, and I just want to bring it to the present day. In 1989, the governor of Virginia recognized the Monacans as one of 8 tribes of the state of Virginia. 8 ancestral historic tribes. That was in 1989. In 2018, in February of 2018, the Monacan people, after a long wait, were recognized by Congress and the President as a federally recognized tribe, acknowledging their deep history, acknowledging their role in the history of Jamestown and Virginia, acknowledging their long persistence as a community, even as they've moved around. A couple of years ago, we had a session. That's Karen Wood on the left, former Chief Kenneth Branham, and Danny Red-Algear, who sadly passed away a few years ago. But we had a session in the Rotunda to talk about what Jefferson has written about Monacan Indians, and it was a pretty interesting session. So I'm going to stop there, and if you have questions about the current community, I'll be happy to answer them, or the past. And I thank you very much for your attention. Boys got the lights. Okay. Yes.
So none of these sites are on the National Register for Historic Places currently, or pending?
Are these sites on the
Yeah, these cities of note.
Can you repeat the question?
The National Register for Historic Places, I'm surprised to find that none of the cities, none of these actual sites are actually logged on the register. Generally, once they're in the register, they're given protections from the federal government, especially with the pipeline coming through.
That site is on the National Register.
It is on the register.
And Montessuquepenoa and the district around it is as well. So Rassawik, which is at Point of Forks, Columbia, Savannah County, where the pipeline is coming through, or the water,
The station.
the water pump station, and they're going to send water up to Zion Crossroads.
Yeah.
It is on the register, and the sad reality is the register is a nice honorary, but when it comes down to the Army Corps of Engineers or the register, they definitely have to engage in a lot more mitigation, right? They definitely, and that's going on right now. They have to plan the impact on this National Register site, but it doesn't shut down anyone.
So sad.
Another factor is once you get, well, throughout Virginia, most historic sites are on private land. And private landowners are not often interested in having anything that might limit, even though we say over and over again, it's not going to limit anything. But most landowners, it's a rare landowner that seeks to have their property on the register. If you'll allow me, one of the project I talk about in the book is the Monacan people weren't allowed to go to any schools in the 20th century, which is to say there were black schools, there were white schools, and Monacan people could not attend either. And so the Episcopal Church established a mission and a one-room log cabin school. And people my age, very young, they went to that school. And this sadness turned into a point of pride. And I'm telling you this story because the Monacan people restored the cabin. And if you turn to the pages of National Register sites for Amherst County, it's this Georgian mansion and this Georgian mansion and this Georgian mansion, and the log cabin schoolhouse at Bear Mountain, where the Monacan people went to school. It is on the National Register, a point of great pride. It's a sad story. Yeah.
You mentioned displacement several times, and I wonder if you could describe how the displacement happened and whether the information comes from Monacan sources or colonial sources.
Interesting. Definitely not colonial source. Well, a little of each. So the largest displacement was when the French Huguenots came to Richmond at the invitation of the General Assembly. And they casually say, well, we settled the French Huguenots in a former Monacan town. Well, it had been a Monacan town a week before. So there's that kind of, it's kind of rare that the state got involved in physically relocating people in Piedmont. But when you drive past the town of Monacan town, that's where it was. And settlers routinely stole Indian land because it was cleared. It was already cleared. Half the work was done, maybe more than that. So there's that level. Another level comes from the archaeology, and I've been talking about this site lately. Displacement meant the large towns, like a Montesupano, like a Rassawick. They split and settled in small hamlets in the mountains. And anthropologists would say they were trying to get beyond the gaze of the colonial government. So in our community, in Albemarle, I had the opportunity, I wasn't expecting it, I'll be honest with you, we stumbled into, my students and I, a small hamlet, 1 or 2 houses, where the Licking Hole Creek reservoir is. And the houses were made of thatch and they burned down. Once they burn, you can date them using radiocarbon dating. The dates came back in the 17th century. So, so where did the people from the large villages go? Well, some went here and some went there, and some went more into Crozet and Ivy, and eventually down to Bear Mountain, Lynchburg, Peddler's Mill. It's hard to, they really dispersed. So does that answer your question?
I think so.
It doesn't
follow up. Was it violent, or was this disbursement because they thought they needed to leave to avoid violence?
I don't see any evidence or documentary history of violence. But without working with the language, this is the kind of violence people were, one wonders what would have happened had the people of Monacan told the General Assembly, we're not going anywhere, you can settle your French Huguenots somewhere else. Then there might have been violence. So the Monacan response, something else I read about it a lot, was the Powhatan Indians, who had been their good friends, but the Powhatan Indians saw trade opportunities and opportunities for political alliance. That's why Powhatan's daughter marries an Englishman. There's alliances, there's trade. And the Monacan people completely backed away. And for that, they lived a century, I would say, in greater peace. But their role in history is only now being reconstructed or talked about in ways other than the usual colonial dismissal of the mountain people. All biases you may think about for mountain people, the English came with them in 1607 and described the Monacans that way too. It's kind of amazing and sad.
Yes. Follow on from that, I live in Rockbridge. Does or when does the valley become part of the story?
Early. In Rockbridge, in Augusta, on the west side, basically, of Route 81, are where the first Monacan mounds are. They're not as big as the ones to the east. I don't know why. It's a puzzle for me still. But they are part of the story early on. And Rockbridge has a site called Hayes Creek Mound. It's written about it, and it is dramatic. The artifacts from that site are at the Smithsonian. Now the Monacans are federally recognized, they'll be coming home. That's part of the benefit of federal recognition. But they're part of the 12,000-year-old story. And when the polity that we call the Monacans of the James and the Rappahannock, when that forms, it forms actually first in more western counties like Rockbridge and neighboring counties. And there are 9 of those earthen mounds there, between Lewis Creek, Augusta. Anyway, it's very much part of the story. But then it's like people move east, and as everybody knows, in the valley, it's not really repopulated that much. Always referred to as a warrior path. There's an assumption that the Iroquois are constantly sending warriors down. I don't see any evidence of that. I don't get it, but that's the story that we tell. Yes?
I'm a native of Charlottesville, and you may have been describing what I call the old polo field as the area where soccer went to.
Yes.
And anyway, to make a long story short, there's an urban legend that there was a great massacre of the Monacan Indians in that area, in that flat area, by the local citizens. My impression is that sometime during the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century. Have you ever run into that story?
Well, not in the 1900s, but that...
19th century.
19th century.
Late 1800s to the early 1900s. After the post-Civil War, pre-World War I.
I think that's, no, I haven't, but it makes sense if you read Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, chapter 11, on what he calls Aborigines. And he gets a lot of credit for testing the theory of whether these 1,000 people who were buried here were part of a massacre. Was this a warrior's battle? Which most people assumed it was. All these earthen burial mounds I've referred to were assumed to be the final resting place of warriors who met, sort of Game of Thrones style, had it out, and then they buried everybody right there. That when Jefferson, in response to the French request for more information on these monuments, when he dug into the mound, he carried that story with him and came out and said, I have found children's remains. I have not found a single skull or body part that's been pierced by a arrow point. This is a community, this is the word in 35 years I've never learned to pronounce. Sepulchral. Sepulchral. That's Jefferson. This is a community, Jefferson said they buried their dead, like, and so on and so on and so on in groups of 25 to 30. So I think the massacre story may be an appropriation of that
Even though it's a century later.
18th, yeah, because he's writing that up in 1784. But I myself have never seen evidence of violent death. I've seen death from people who fell or maybe got hit with there's a dent in their skull that was lethal. But out of the thousands of people, it's a small number. And I want to stress again, anytime we encounter human remains, we're there because the Monacans have said, yes, this would be important for us. And the state, the federal government, everyone agrees, as soon as they're excavated, respectfully, they're studied sometimes, and then they're returned to the Monacan people. And there's a burial mound in Amherst County now where all the remains from Hayes Creek, the Rapidan River Mound. It's very moving to see that. Yes.
Forgive me if this point is mistaken, but I have read some sources that seem to think that prior to the arrival of Europeans, that a lot of native populations were much larger than was like originally estimated or recorded, and that through disease and other factors that what settlers say, more in North America and particularly in this area we're encountering were remnants of larger populations. Do you see any evidence for that in the area, or do you feel that like what John Smith may have encountered was a traditional way of life that stretched back, as you were saying, to like 1000 AD or longer?
There's a very big question in the region, and close to the time I started doing this research was the 500th anniversary of the Columbus's arrival. And Americans got very comfortable with the fact that Columbus didn't mean anything. He just brought all these pathogens. He brought all these deadly infectious diseases, and that's what destroyed Indian culture. Now, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the American Southwest, smallpox, absolute devastation. In the Chesapeake, we look for it all the time. With the Haudenosaunee, with the Iroquois people, we look all the time. Is there evidence of mass graves where infectious disease might have caused it? And short answer is we don't see it. So yes, in Hispaniola, yes, in Zuni, in Arizona, New Mexico, yes, in Mexico City. So I would never dismiss the issue, but we overgeneralized it, and from Canada to the Carolinas now, my colleagues in the field are all saying we just don't see it. Now maybe because when I say Hispaniola, when I say the Southwest, that's 1492, that's 1519, maybe that's the early impact. 1607 is late, and so some resistance to European diseases may have built up. But I don't think any of us want to say for sure it didn't happen, but we don't see the physical evidence of it as we do elsewhere. Now slavery, there was enslavement of American Indians, and that's a story that's just coming out now that Virginians should know. So the disappearance of people, not due to disease, but what appears in the records as this man was found, I'll give you an example. This man was found guilty of murder. Because he didn't admit to it, we find his whole community guilty of murder, an Indian. Because he's guilty, we're sending him to the West Indies. with all the other men from his community. That's a one-way ticket. They didn't say, we're sending you, you're an indentured servant, we're sending you for 5 years, you'll be back, we'll serve your time, everything's going to be okay. So we don't talk about Indian slavery very much, but in the Carolinas it's been well documented. And I'm not doing this research, but I think you'll see that story in Virginia pretty soon. Cool.
Yeah, first I want to applaud your suggestion that we have some kind of, and you and I have talked about this personally, some kind more signage in this region that recognizes this ancestral land of the Monacans and then the ancestors of the Monacan people who've been here for many, many thousands of years, and we're real newcomers from Europe, most. But can you take a moment to reflect and connect some dots between, say, the Jim Crow Constitution of 1902 in Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, up until what that federal recognition in 2017 was such a big deal, and absolutely, really, if you study the history, it's shocking that this identity, this culture of this people managed to survive when the law, the government, everything was trying to make them disappear throughout the 20th century, trying to wipe them from the landscape and pretend like they weren't here, right in front of us.
The phrase that Native people use is documentary genocide, not going back to, not to 1802, but to the eugenics, to the phrase that's used. Coy's asking about the eugenics laws, the racial integrity laws, especially 1924. And these were written in part using the Monacan community in Amherst as a test case, and they were abused. I mean, they were identified using all the language without medical knowledge, without study, but mostly by surname. The state spent time in the community and then pronounced individuals and families to be feeble-minded and promiscuous, and all these reasons why they might be sterilized, they might not be allowed to marry. I think if you go back to the 19th century and you remember Andrew Jackson required Southern Indians to move to the Oklahoma Territory. And there's a widespread assumption that that meant all Indians from the Abenaki and the Penobscot in Maine to the Seminole in Florida all moved to Oklahoma. I mean, a lot of people really believe that. There can't be Indians in Virginia because they were required to, Andrew Jackson had them move out. Well, they didn't move out. I mean, that's just a widespread resistance. They were in the mountains, they were in their communities, they were not going to Oklahoma. So when Walter Plecker, and when you say that name in Monacan, I don't often utter that name. When the state's Bureau of Vital Statistics pushed the General Assembly to pass a law that required that a person could either be black or white and nothing else, and that all these Indian people were neither, they became non-persons. They couldn't go to any schools. They couldn't get jobs, etc., etc. And so it's very painful. It's a painful memory for our whole state. With Mitch Vanier, he's taking the lead. The General Assembly apologized for the policies of racial integrity. Mark Warner, when he was governor, apologized. But there's a lot. There should be some. There's a lot still to recognize the pain that was felt and the divisions that were created. Say there was a family that identified as black and white, and black and Indian. And then here comes the state's Bureau of Biostatistics. Well, there are no Indians, and you can't be black and Indian. So they would just redefine everybody. Some of the most emotional stories I've heard is, again, people not much older than me, who delivered babies at Lynchburg General Hospital in the 40s and 50s, older than me, they would talk about when the nurse would come around and say, well, what's the racial identity of your child? If they said Indian, the nurse was instructed to write down whatever she thought was the better answer. And so if you wanted to get married, you had to, as we know in Virginia, until the Loving case, you had to identify race. And Virginia didn't allow Indian as a racial identity. So it caused a lot of division within families, between black communities and Indian communities, and then united against the white supremacists that ruled the General Assembly at that point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, what do you think finally got the federal government to sign on to this? I mean, was it a Trump thing? I mean, he said, "Oh, I want to do this," or
what got the federal government to give federal recognition to
Right.
Trump? That was about 12 years or more of political lobbying, a lot of attorneys doing pro bono work, correcting the historical record. If you're Indian, let's see, you claim to be Indian, but we see this birth certificate here says you weren't.
Right.
And the tribal people said, well, that's because the nurse crossed out what I wrote, and you turn it over. The Bureau of Biostatistics had a list of surnames, and the nurses were taught that when a person with this surname comes in, don't listen to what they tell you, because they're just trying to be something that doesn't exist. So there was this tremendous effort to first correct the documentary record. True story. When you change your birth certificate, you change your marriage license for any reason, maybe they spelled your name wrong or something, there's a $10 charge. So the Monacans get the General Assembly to pass legislation where the state apologizes. They will allow them to change their birth certificates, marriage licenses, draft status, like the service cards. And they said, but it's going to cost you $10. And they said, we're not paying. This is your mistake. And they won. It delayed the process, not delayed, it took another year, but they were right. So there was that effort. This is a longer story than I think you all want tonight, but the Monacan people joined with 5 other tribes in a consortium. And there are 2 paths to recognition. One is through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it can take 100 years for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to act on anything. The second path that, oddly enough, Ronald Reagan opened up, he couldn't have imagined what he was doing alive, but in this case, couldn't have imagined. The second path is to have your congressional delegation bring forward a bill that says, the state of Virginia agrees these tribes should be recognized by the federal government. If Congress agrees, they'll be federally recognized. And that's the path the Monacans took. It took a long time, but in 2017, it was Trump who signed the legislation. Everybody I know says it's one thing that guy did right.
Yeah.
It was what they call in the Senate, in the Congress, and in General Assembly, what's the term? When several bills are lumped together, and most people don't even know what's in them. Omnibus or
amendments.
So it was one of those. If that's the way it's going to be, that's fine.
Yeah.
That was the opinion. So along with how many pine trees can be cut down in the forests of California, and whatever federal legislation was, it was packaged at the end of the session, and it passed. And every tribal chief of the 6 tribes didn't know that it was happening. For all the work they had done, they didn't know that it was happening. And they got phone calls, like winning the lottery, They get phone calls, they say, good news, you're now federally, the Pamunkey, not the Pamunkey had already been there, the Chickahominy, the Nansemond, the Rappahannock, the Monacan, they each got a phone call, and each chief said, who is this? It's been going on, I got no patience for this. And they go, no, really, we're your lawyers, it's passed. Trump signed it this morning. So that's, you know.
At the same time, they've got a pipeline coming through.
Yeah, but that's true, and that's a hell of a fight.
Yeah.
But they're standing. They would have no standing were they not federally recognized. They would be on the outside saying, we consider that our ancestral territory. But now the Corps and the study teams that look at alternative processes, I can't say any more because it's all being worked out right now, but they are frontline players in this. Yes, they don't want it to happen, but if it happens, they're respected as a federally recognized tribe. There are 567 federally recognized tribes, most of them in the West, so the Monacan status in the East is great. And stuff getting things back from the Smithsonian, now we're ripped out of their burial mounds, and money for scholarships and health care. They've waited a long time, it is a big deal. Well, I thank you all.
Thank you, Jeff.